Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Um, we're going to wait till about probably 10 or 2 or so before we get going and, really start getting into the nuts and bolts of everything. So give us a minute or two here and we'll start rocking and rolling. So we'll give it about one more minute or so just to make sure everyone can get in, and then we'll get going. Hello, everyone. For people just joined, probably want to give it just about one more minute, maybe a little bit less than that, just for people who are showing up a little bit late. And we'll get going in just a couple seconds here. All right, it's 10:02, so let's get rocking and rolling. Thank you again, everyone, for taking the time to log into this webinar and go over multifamily insurance with me. I'm excited to provide some insights and valuable information to everyone. So yeah, before we get into the nuts and bolts and everything, wanted to share some information about myself, my company, in case we've never met before and we've never talked. First and foremost, we are not insurance professionals. We don't want to market ourselves as insurance professionals. However, insurance is a very common topic we're talking with owners about. And so we've had some good insights that we've learned over the past few years. So we wanted to share this with other people who are navigating multifamily insurance. So yeah, that's why we're here today. But yeah, so I work for a company called Visintainer Group. We're a commercial and multifamily real estate investment brokerage based here in Fresno, California, but we really work the whole Central Valley from Bakersfield up to Modesto. We do a lot of advisory on acquisitions and dispositions of property, as well as 1031 exchange advisory. I personally specialize in multifamily. That's really the only asset class I focus in. So I do helping people buy and sell multifamily assets, but then also do advisory and consulting work during hold periods, right? And as you can imagine, insurance is a very common topic. I'm talking to my clients and owners who are in my market about. So with that, we thought it'd be great to put something together and share things that we've learned. So yeah, quick agenda of what we're going to be going over today. First and foremost, what's going on in insurance? Why is it such a big topic? I'm sure most of you know a lot of this, but a quick overview of what's brought us here today. Then we're going to start to talk and get into the nuts and bolts of it all. Start with physical property characteristics. After that, we'll go over different management practices. From there, different rental or lease and rental agreement things to be thinking about as you're putting your leases together. And then from there, general property safety features. And then at the very end, more or less a quick summary of all of those items and actual items to be thinking about as you go about managing your property or you're talking with clients who own property. So yeah, why are we talking about insurance? What has brought us here today? First and foremost, it's premium cost. 3, 4, 5 years ago, we used to see premiums on a per door basis at $250 a door, $350 a door, maybe 400. Nowadays, I am often seeing policies at $1,200 a door. I've even seen policies at $2,000 a door. That's a fourfold increase in a lot of premiums for owners. And I'm sure, as a lot of us know, rents are not climbing at the same rate. So it's been a big problem, hurting the bottom line for a lot of owners, and it's an issue. A lot of owners too are just straight getting non-renewed. Mercury, State Farm have been, dropping policies left and right. over the past few years. And what that typically means for owners is they're often having to go to the surplus lines market. It means a lot of different things, but what it most typically definitely means is a large increase in premium. And then if they have a problem there, they end up on the California Fair Plan. And then that's where we start to see premiums at $2,000 a door in some scenarios. And I'm seeing more and more people on the Fair Plan. So, it's the big issue for a lot of owners and investors. And then if you are, thinking about selling property or in the process of buying property, insurance is becoming an issue. I've seen escrows delayed weeks, if not, months sometimes because of insurance problems. Lenders require insurance to loan on properties. They need to make sure it's bound. And I've seen, carriers require, X, Y, and Z happen before binding, and it could take, weeks to remediate some of these issues. So it's delaying escrows, and it's been a big issue in transactions we've seen. All right, well, so now to get into the real meat of it, we're going to start with physical property characteristics. So yeah, these are the main systems of your buildings, right? Your roof, your HVACs, your plumbing. You need to understand, what is the current condition of these items, right? I'm not suggesting that you need a brand new roof before you get a new policy or before you go sell a building. However, understanding the condition of these items are very important, right? If let's say you have an 8-year-old roof, 10, 12, maybe even 15-year-old roof, but you go to your insurance professionals and you're like, hey, I just had this roof looked at a month ago. The professional recommended I do $1,000 worth of work. And with that, it has another 8 years of lifespan. If you're able to show that this is the current state and this is how much useful lifespan you have left, it gives you a lot of negotiating power when you're talking with your carriers, when you're talking with your brokers, and puts you in a better position when it comes to your premium. Same thing with HVACs. I don't necessarily think you need a brand new HVAC, but understanding what is the condition and being able to show and document that you're taking care of these things, and then being able to provide that to your insurance professionals. I have it checked out, multiple times a year or once a year. And as of the last time, there was no leaks, and there's another 5 years of the lifespan estimated to be left. And providing this information to your insurance professionals helps them, vouch for you and the property, and ultimately get you better premiums, ideally. Plumbing, a lot of properties nowadays have galvanized plumbing. It's not ideal. Carriers, from what we hear, do not like galvanized plumbing. They would prefer you to have updated copper or other updated plumbing. But it's not necessarily the end of the world if you have galvanized plumbing. Again, it's about having the documentation of, hey, this is our maintenance program for our plumbing. This is the last time we've had our main line scoped. This was the condition, and this is what we're doing to prevent problems down the line. If you're able to do these things, it goes a long way. Stairways, balconies, and landings. I'm sure many of you know there was a law passed a few years ago, SB 721, that had to do with balconies and stairways and structural integrity. So owners are now required to make sure they're structurally sound. Carriers are also wanting to see that as well. So having the documentation that you've had inspections done goes a long way. Probably the most important item on this whole page is your electrical panels. If you have a Zinsco and Sylvania electrical panel, I'm surprised if you even have insurance still. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, a carrier's got word that you have a Zinsco panel and they're just dropping your policy, or, issues start to arise. So if you have Zinsco or Sylvania panels or Federal Pacific, Challenger, it's time to start making a game plan over the X amount time period. I'm going to start replacing these to get to the updated panels so that, I'm in compliance with my insurance. Zinsco and Sylvania were originally installed back in the 60s and 70s. Same with Federal Pacific, and then Challenger in the 80s. So, if you have properties in that age frame, go and check, understand what you have. And then if you have these brands, it's time to start making a plan. Okay, this is how I'm going to remediate this over X period of time. Location, it's something that is important. Most owners here in the Valley probably don't have to worry about this, but if you have a property that's, in a high fire risk area, like say in the mountains, in the forest, or if you're right on a river, right, in a flood area, it's something that's a red flag for carriers. So, understanding whether you're in these areas, but then if you are, again, taking preventative steps to ensure you're putting yourself in the best positions possible, and then providing that documentation with your carriers and brokers, right? If you're in a fire risk area in the forest, showing them that, okay, this is how often I'm cleaning the brush up. I make sure my trees are so far apart, in order to have, a good fire preventative program. Same thing with being on a river, showing them I do X, Y, and Z to help prevent floods. Having that type of documentation and plans in place gives you power when talking to your carriers and brokers on why you should be having, better insurance premiums. Awesome. So here are the couple pictures of electrical panels. If you have the one on the far right, a Zinsco panel, I would start planning probably in a couple minutes from now how exactly you're going to start getting those out of your units. They're a big red flag. Essentially what happens is there's been a lot of instances where the breakers don't trip and they become a high, fire risk problems. So understand, if you have any of these, then you have Federal, Pacific, and Challenger on the very far left. All right, different management considerations now to be thinking about. Perfect. So first here, very often insurance professionals like for properties to be professionally managed. I know sometimes it doesn't always make sense if it's a really small property to have it professionally managed, but often professional insurance professionals and carriers do like to see that. They see professionals as having systems and in place to help prevent deferred maintenance and things of those lines. So it's highly wanted in many cases. If you have a high concentration of students or tenants on with affordable housing Section 8 vouchers, it's often raised as a red flag by insurance carriers. Students have very high turnover rates, and then affordable housing Section 8 vouchers are just generally seen as a higher risk. So if you have a large concentration of those, it's something to keep in mind as it's often raised as a red flag. Implementing pre-move-in walkthroughs with tenants. If you haven't already started to implement this into your management practice, going through the units prior to moving with the tenants, documenting this is the current state of the unit. If there's things that are brought up that need to be resolved prior to move-in, documenting that and showing that there was a resolution and being able to provide them. This is your system and this is how it was resolved, and having this all in files that you're able to give to your insurance professionals goes a long way. Background checks. If you have a property that's large, let's say a couple hundred units, and you have, let's say, some full-time maintenance staff, maybe some full-time leasing on staff, doing background checks on your employees is very important. Insurance professionals want to make sure you don't have people with a sideways history working for you, and that your company is sound working professionals. When you have contractors coming, different outside third-party vendors coming, say to replace the roof, or to be doing large painting projects, getting up on tall walls, you need to make sure that these professionals are licensed and, most importantly, insured. If they aren't, you're putting yourselves at great risk, and your insurance professionals want to know that you're hiring people that meet these qualifications. Another thing to think about: when tenants are moving out, always rekeying units. You never know how many people made copies of keys, who they gave them to. So making sure as a management practice, you're always rekeying units after move out is very important. On-site laundry. Again, a lot of insurance professionals do prefer that they're professionally managed, but if they're not, having a documented system in place showing, this is how often we do maintenance, and make sure they're up to a cleanliness standard, is something that, you're able to provide and, help with your insurance negotiations. Awesome. Some more management tips here. Communicate proactively, right? Things do happen. Doesn't matter how great of an operator you are, things are going to happen. A tenant is going to slip and fall. Issues do arise. Often, if you communicate proactively with your tenants, you're able to resolve issues before they become bigger problems and eventually claims. Not to say that there aren't sometimes situations that it would make sense to put in a claim for, but then there's oftentimes when things do arise, and just by acting proactively with your tenants, you're able to resolve issues before a claim needs to be submitted, which ideally would put you in a better position when coming and talking with your insurance professionals. Obviously, more claims on your policy, the more scrutiny you get. Having quarterly inspections, coming through once a quarter, serving tenant notices saying, hey, we're going to come through and check the air filters out, right? You go through, make sure the air filters are clean, but also quick look around. Is there problems in the bathroom, right? Is there mold on the ceiling? Is there leaks underneath the faucet in the kitchen? Is there leaks in the ceiling? Going through and having a documented plan and process to be doing quarterly inspections, is an important management practice, but having the documentation that you're doing that goes a long way when talking to insurance professionals. Having a formal repair guidelines on how you guys like to resolve issues, right? Let's say someone reports a roof leak. Having a written practice of, okay, when this happens, this is how quickly we like to respond. These are the 3 vendors we go to every single time, and this is, our preferred timeline to getting this resolved. Having a documented process is very important. Obviously, acting promptly to maintenance as quickly as possible. The last thing you want is a $2,000 problem to become a $20,000 problem, which happens. I've seen time again, acting as quickly as possible, right, before things get out of hand, before a leak becomes a much bigger leak, things like that. Preventative maintenance programs, making sure you have a pest control program. And, this also goes and speaks to the first topics we were talking about, the physical characteristics, having a program in place where I'm checking on the roof once a year. Once a year, this is the vendor that comes out, makes sure my roof's in good shape. So having a documented program in place is very important and puts you in a strong position for insurance negotiations. And then again, encouraging tenant engagement. Beyond claims, you want your tenants to come to you guys, right? At the end of the day, you guys are in business together. They're leasing property from you. And when there's issues that arise, you want to know about it as the owner. You don't want your tenant to think, oh, I'm not going to tell the owner about this or the management about this because they're going to raise my rent or there's going to be some retaliation. They're not going to be happy. No, the reality is when there are issues that arise, you want to know about it so you can, again, fix them before they become bigger problems. I've seen in many situations where we're in an escrow and we start walking units with a new investor and buyer, and we go into a unit and it's in bad shape. There's been a leak in the roof from the unit above for a long time, and it's just in bad shape. And the owner goes, well, I haven't been in this unit for 6 years and they don't tell me about anything, right? You want to make sure there's communication about what's going on in their unit. All right, next we have different rental and lease agreement practices and things to be thinking about when it comes to your leases. First and foremost is the application process. Obviously having a written policy, a written application process, is a good program to have. Making sure that you have documented. We make sure all of our tenants have above an XYZ credit score, or all of our tenants are making X, Y, and Z in proportion to the monthly rent, right? Having these documented processes that you guys are always maintaining and following is a great practice, and ensures that you guys get stable tenants over the long term. But carriers like to see it. Prompt maintenance reporting obligation. Not just you want to encourage tenant, but put it in the lease. Tell them, hey, it's required. When something happens, you are required to tell us about it. Put some of the obligation on them that, hey, when there's a leak, you must come tell us, right? And hopefully that can help encourage some of that. Pet addendums, something that I've seen come up many times, where I've been walking a deal before with a new prospective investor. All of a sudden, there's a tenant that comes by with a German Shepherd, and he's like, "Oh, that's probably going to be an issue," because he knows, because of his conversations with his insurance carriers, that German Shepherds are a big no-no. Often there are policies where they say only X, Y, and Z breeds are allowed at the property, and then X, Y, and Z breeds are absolutely not allowed at the property. So understanding, what your insurance brokers or carriers are concerned about, and then including that into the lease is a great policy to have. Tenant liability insurance, making sure your tenants have liability insurance, it helps take some risk off of you. Great policy to have. Insurance carriers like to see it. And then the bottom right here, just some more common written, policies that we like to see in leases. A lot of these are very common. No grilling or barbecuing on the balconies or patio areas could be a hazard. No storage of, high flammable devices. Propane tanks, lithium-ion batteries, that can be, fire hazards more or less. No trampolines, inflatable pools, hot tubs, water beds, not just some of them safety hazards, but say they explode, there's a big water problem. You don't want those issues arising in your units. Making sure the tenants aren't altering any of the electrical, plumbing, not rekeying the units themselves, and writing this all out in the lease are great practices to have. All right, next here we have general property safety features. All right, so making sure that all the units have their carbon monoxide and smoke detectors, right? And not just do they have them, they're working. So maybe when you're doing your quarterly inspections, testing them. Are they working? Are they installed? It's very important, not just for the safety of the property, but if you could show your carriers that you're ensuring that is the case on a quarterly basis, it goes a long way. If you have a pool or a spa, making sure the gates have the right latch that allows them to lock, so there's no little kids running around and you're able to avoid accidents. Exterior lighting. This is actually a very common conversation I have with owners. Beyond insurance, I always highly recommend that there's ample exterior lighting. It gives a property a much more safe feel, an inviting feel. If you have lighting in the parking lot, in the driveway areas, in the common walkway areas, it gives it a safer feel. I've also seen rents. People get upticks in rents because they've gone through and installed exterior lighting. So I always advise for that. And then obviously your carriers like to see that from a safety perspective as well. If you have window security bars, they need to have safety mechanisms to release in case if there's a fire or something. Railing designs for balconies and stair rails. The qualifications of what's in code and what's not in code changes every so often, but you want to make sure you're in code. Basically, the railways need to be so close to each other so people's legs don't slip out, or little children can't slip through the bars. So making sure those are up to code is very important. Having annual and biannual reviews of the heating elements. So maybe this is a part of your quarterly inspections, but if there are interior radiators or wall heaters, you want to make sure there's no furniture in front of them. If the furniture is really close to the wall space heater, it becomes a fire hazard, right? You don't want the furniture up against the register where the heating and the AC come through, as it could be a fire hazard. So making sure that's not the case when you're doing your quarterly inspections. And then of course, making sure the water heaters are up to the California standard for bracing. Awesome. Well, so that's a quick overview of a lot of it. And yeah, a quick checklist, just to be keeping in mind as you go about, you know, thinking about how you want to be managing your investments going forward. First and foremost, honestly, if you have a Zinsco Sylvania electrical panel, start thinking about that as soon as you get off this call. That's going to have to be addressed immediately. Understanding the condition of your roof, HVACs, the main systems, you want to know what you're dealing with because the carriers are going to ask. And if you know and you're able to provide documentation on this is, the state of my property and this is how much is left in useful life, it goes a long way. Whenever you're doing updates, documenting it. I was in the kitchen and we updated this amount of plumbing to copper. Keep that on record. You could show it to your insurance professionals. Understand if you're in a flood or fire area, and then if you are, do whatever measures make sense to help put you into a better position. And then verifying all safety devices are compliant, right? That's your smoke detectors, carbon monoxide, the pool latch, right? The gate latch, the pool, make sure they're all up to compliance. If you have contractors at the property, make sure they're professionally licensed and insured. Very important. Start implementing a move-in walkthrough process with the tenants, making sure you understand the condition of the unit before you let them move in. Always rekeying when tenants move out. Background checks on employees. You want to make sure you don't have someone with a problem history to be working with you. Always asking, and requiring renters to have liability coverage. And starting a quarterly inspection on a good cadence and showing you have documentation that you're doing these types of proactive measures. Having the preventative programs, like pest control, annual roof checks, great to have on file. Always recording when maintenance requests are submitted and then how they're resolved. It's more ammunition to show the carrier that you're being proactive. And then again, yeah, always making sure you use licensed professionals. Awesome. Well, so really, everyone, the my real goal here is that if you take some of these tips home, some of this advice, and you start implementing it into your ownership practice, and you start doing this, and you have a property, and your neighbor has the same exact property, and he's not doing these action items, and he doesn't have the documentation on it, you should not be paying the same amount in insurance premium, right? If you're being proactive and you are doing, the right things and the right steps to put you in a better position, you're able to document that, most importantly, you shouldn't be paying the same premium as someone is not. So always highly recommend, you know, taking as much as this you can, implementing it as much as you can, and then hopefully as you talk to your brokers, it puts everyone into a better situation. So if you guys need insurance professionals to talk to, I do have a lot that I would recommend. I'm happy to recommend people to you. So feel free to email me or call me after this. And if you have questions just about multifamily in general, I'm always happy to help on any fronts multifamily. So yeah, feel free to reach out anytime. We are going to do a Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to send them my way. All right, one person asked if if I own an older property, what are the first 2 or 3 things I should inspect before my next renewal? Really it's the main systems, right? Electrical panels, roof, HVACs, and then as a fourth, plumbing. You want to understand the condition of all these before you start negotiating with your brokers and carriers. All right. James Lee asks, which is most accurate for property coverage? The company in Bakersfield say $130 a square foot. Some people say $200 a unit, and contractors say $200 to $300 a unit. If you have brand new property, that's built in the past 5 to 10 years, we're still seeing premiums in that $500 to $600 a door range. But then beyond that, if your property is basically older than 1990, we're seeing premiums as high as 800, again, 800 to $1,200 a door. So I typically look at it on a per door basis. And so that's typically what I'm seeing. And so I think that should be, kind of answers the other questions as well. What's a good premium? I mean, if you have older property, get down to $750 a unit. That's great. Brand new property, maybe you're closer to $500 a unit. You recommend a master policy. We own a 6-unit apartment complex. Not sure what you mean by a master policy, but make sure you have property and the liability coverage from a reputable carrier is very important. James, I'm going to come back to your questions and the rest of them in a little bit. Let me get to these other ones real quick. My rental agreement is already 43 pages. I got more to add after this podcast. Glad to hear it. How far in advance of an insurance renewal should an owner start preparing? I would say at minimum 2 months ahead of a renewal, you should start these conversations with your broker. 2 months allows you to, understand and have conversations on what prior to binding insurance. Your broker's going to go out and talk with the market, and then they're going to give you feedback on what you're going to need. So that's why 2 months is a minimum. If you start 3 to 4 months out, maybe they can give you some pointers on the front end as well, so that when that 2-month mark comes around, they start talking to carriers, you're in the best position possible. What deductible do you recommend? That's really a question to have between you and your insurance professional. James, again, I'm not an insurance professional. I'm just a multifamily advisor. So that'd really be up to the individual and their insurance broker. The biggest levers to lower premium, having the documentation and making sure you're doing even the small updates, right? You don't need a brand new roof, you don't need brand new HVACs, but knowing what you have and being able to show that things have useful life goes a long way. Do you agree value and blanket policies are necessary? If you're able to get a large policy, a blanket umbrella policy to cover the large portfolio, I've seen that help cut costs for a lot of large operators. So if you're able to get one, that's great. Do you recommend replacement costs over ACV? Again, James, I'm not quite positive what you're asking there, but happy to maybe hop online after this and we can talk about it more. And yeah, James, again, on a per square foot basis, hard for me to say, but I could definitely, let me follow up with you after this and I will get some clarity there. Aaron, your question, you asked if carriers are looking at older properties again with galvanized pipe. The answer to that, from what I've seen and heard from the insurance professionals that I've talked with, is there are carriers that will bind with galvanized piping. But again, what they're doing is they're asking the hard questions. They want to make sure that there have been no major leaks lately. So if you're able to understand the condition of these systems, it's very much possible. We have a property right now we're marketing, and it's built in 1972, a 244 unit complex, and they have their insurance policy at about $800 a door. 1972 build, but they've been doing updates. They have the documentation, which helps them with their leverage. Yeah, James, we have a comment here regarding your questions. James, we will be able to send a recording to this to everyone who has joined, as well as to others as well. So, does insurance cover a change of ownerships free and clear? Do you recommend an umbrella policy as well? Well, if you own the property free and clear, you technically don't need insurance. So It's possible. I mean, you could decide to just have liability insurance to cover yourself. Again, I'm not an insurance professional. I'm not recommending that per se, but it definitely changes the dynamic a little bit as what is required. But at the end of the day, if you want full property coverage, full liability, I'm sure it's similar to whether you have a loan or not. Awesome. Well, if there's no more questions here, I hope that this was valuable information for everyone. And yes, we will be sending out a copy of this video to everyone who's joined and make it available to others as well. So thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, feel free to give me a holler anytime, phone call, email, whatever works. So thank you all.